Little bit of a heads up, because of the nature of this video, there will be no images that are going to be important. Watch the video, or just leave it on in the background if you want. I just wanted to let you know ahead of time that this video is completely available in an audio-only format, if that works better for you. Listen to it in the car or something. Anyways, here we go. Act 1. Video killed the radio drama. Recently for Christmas, my roommate bought me the remastered Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy radio plays on CD, and I think I might like the radio play more than the books, which I didn't know that was even possible, seeing as Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is my favorite trilogy in 5 books. It all comes down to a single thing in my mind, I think. The snappiness of the jokes and the trimming of the fat. With radio plays, there's no reason to spend pages upon pages describing the halls of the Heart of Gold or the planet Margathea. Instead, the radio play uses sound to invoke an image in your mind, and it works pretty well. This way, the writers are spending less time worrying about how stuff worked, and more time making jokes about a whale and a bowl of petunias being created in upper orbit. The reason I spent so long on this little tangent here is to say that while video didn't kill the radio star, video did murder the medium of an audio-only storytelling format. And that's not to say it's totally dead. D&D podcasts, and actually just podcasts in general, like Welcome to Night Vale, have brought back the format just a little, even if those are a little niche. Tangential to all of this is the odd album of music that tells a story, and I want to talk about a couple of those albums today. So sit tight, grab a drink or something, and let me tell you about some of my favorite albums of music and the stories they tell. Act 2. David Wirsig and the Campfire Story Album. The following story has not been altered or adapted. To my best recollection, it's exactly how it happened. Back in 2020, before the apocalypse, David Wirsig released a small album named Prodigal. It's not too long of an album, clocking in at just under an hour's worth of music, but it is imaginative and impressive in how it tells a story. A story of abuse and neglect, a story of prodigals, refugees, and those people surrounding them who are either too oblivious or too cold-hearted to help them in their time of need. The story of Darian, the town drunk, struggling to cope with his past and how he failed those around him. The story of Ariel, the battered and abused poet, who can't get away from her abuser. And the story of the abuser, who feels remorse for what he does, but can't change who he is as a person. Leviathan stands out as the most powerful song on the album, as it is really the only one that deals with the abuser himself. Divisive? Probably. Powerful? Definitely. David Wirsig's Prodigals feels like you're sitting in the back room of a party, and the one guy quietly whips out a guitar and says he wants to tell a story. For me, it's simultaneously harrowing and comforting to hear him weave stories of Ariel, Darian, and assuming himself as well, as most of the stories are told through his point of view. Every story within this album works as a standalone song that could be listened to in a car ride or on the bus, but the album is better when taken as a whole. Each song is like a chapter from Ray Bradbury's famous Martian Chronicles. Sure, they work as songs alone, or chapters in a book alone, but their true potential only comes out when you listen to them or read them as a whole. This way of telling a story through episodic music is interesting, subtle, and most importantly can allow the listener to listen to songs out of order or interspaced. Leviathan works as its own song and can still have the same impact without the rest of the music on the album. For this reason, I'm dubbing this type of musical storytelling as campfire stories. And they are the type of musical stories that you would see sitting around a campfire, sipping 40 ounces, and telling stories with your friends. They're grounded and built within realism as people's experiences, and are extremely divisive in their nature. This is extremely unlike the rest of the media I'm going to be talking about in this video, and I wanted to talk about it because I think this album is one of the best I've ever listened to, and invokes so much emotion in how it works that I can only highly recommend it. Act 3. The Dolls of New Albion, a steampunk opera. So now we transition our way into the wild story and music of Paul Shapira. This guy has found a niche and really stuck to it, And while this video was originally just going to talk about the Dolls of New Albion, while writing this, I've been listening to the next 2 albums in the trilogy, and will probably feel the need to talk about them as well. Okay, but we start with the steampunk opera itself. This is the most fleshed out of the trilogy in 4 parts, and is really the only one that's been adapted into a stage production by multiple production companies. This is because the sheet music only exists for the Dolls of New Albion, and does not exist for the rest of the series. From what I've watched on YouTube of these productions, they really just don't hold up to the album and my imagination of itself. The productions are fine, they do a good job of adapting the material that's in place, it just works better as an audio-only format. Paul Shapiro does such a good job of setting the scenes through just the music itself in Dolls of New Albion, specifically, that you can completely deal with the fact that it's just music. This thing has been living in my head for just under a week as I attempt to grapple with the fact that I've never found something like this in over 10 years. The Dolls of New Albion is a story about revenge, loss, death, and at its heart, dealing with the fact that not everything you love loves you back. It tackles social issues and personal issues, and because I really want you to listen to it, I'll stop describing it that way here. The Dolls of New Albion is perfect in its use of leitmotif, and I've fallen in love with the story of Annabelle, Jasper, Edgar, and Priscilla as they make their way through the wild world of New Albion. What makes the Dolls of New Albion work is the use of a narrator who connects the story together and gives you the background on everything. The story is always clear because the narrator specifically has sections of songs that connect the world together like a string. We might be going through multiple generations, but it's very clear what these multiple generations are, who these characters are, and what they're doing. Unlike Prodigals, the songs here require that they be listened to in whole with the entire album, with very few breaks in between. The downfall of telling a story like this is that it requires somebody with an hour and a half worth of time to just sit and listen. You can't really break this up unless you break it up by acts. And I think these work best when you just sit, clear your schedule, clear your mind, and listen. The tale of New Albion is stunning and haunting, and it requires thought and a set of ears to listen and find the nuance. I highly recommend The Dolls of New Albion. Its sprawling city and dynamic characters stuck in my mind, the city being the character that I remember the most. It reacts to every character in a different way, and it's interesting to see it all play together in such a wild and melancholy and horrifying ending that really wraps the entire opera up. There's always a spark, a little light at the end of the tunnel. Now time to talk about its interesting sequel. Act 4. The New Albion Radio Hour, a diesel punk opera. When starting to listen to the New Albion Radio Hour, the first thing you're going to notice is that the narrator is completely different, and that the sound it puts out is totally different. While the steampunk opera used a lot of percussion and sounds that can only be described as steam whistly, they mainly use piano for the backing, and maybe a few bass instruments and the odd theremin, but really it's almost an orchestra for most of the backing of Dolls. In the New Albion Radio Hour, Paul Shapiro has chosen to scale back the band to just a jazz band and the odd theremin along with an occasional guitar. This gives Dolls of Albion a distinct sound in that of a Victorian steampunk setting, and also helps give New Albion Radio Hour its own distinct feel as well. The other thing that's different with Radio Hour is the addition of Lloyd, our host. He's our narrator this time, and for the first time in New Albion history, people speak during the songs. I have no clue why I didn't think of this while recording, but in Dolls they definitely use spoken words to symbolize the soldiers with 7285. Towards the end of the album, in the beginning of Act 4, Scene 6, I Will Bring You Down. While this does contradict what I just said a moment ago, it still does not impact any of my points here or later on down the line, which was that Radio Hour's spoken word is more commonplace. Anyway, carry on. Spoken word during musical storytelling can often backfire pretty hard, but what Radio Hour does to differentiate all of it is to kind of make it staticky, as if you were actually listening to the music on an old-timey radio. This makes the voices feel like distant memories, faded, lifeless. Radio Hour starts with a strong Act 1, follows it up with an okay Act 2 that struggles to keep the pace that Act 1 set, and then hits up with a third act that generally left me reeling backwards. Like, what the fuck? It's definitely what the fuck enough to be a little off-putting for some people, but I think that works for the story. Radio Hour, despite having one act less than Dolls, ends up clocking in over 20 minutes longer, and its focused narrative ends up being a lot more effective in telling a story about characters, as you learn to care more about John O'Brien than you did any of the characters in Dolls. But I do think to do this, Radio Hour sacrifices some of the excellent world building that Dolls of New Albion had. Overall, I think I like Radio Hour's musical style more than Dolls, but there's something that's missing from Radio Hour that I can't exactly put my finger on. I think it makes it slightly worse than Dolls as a whole. Like, the whole is still less than the sum of its parts with Radio Hour, whereas Dolls was the opposite way around, where the whole was greater than the sum of its parts. Radio Hour is still extremely easy to listen to, and I still highly recommend it. I do think that it is a little hair worse than Dolls overall. Before we move on, I will add that a lot of Radio Hour's impact comes from the leitmotif callbacks from Dolls, so I do suggest listening to these all in order. Overall, Radio Hour's dreamlike atmosphere and comfy sounds of jazz and light swing makes it an interesting listen to as it weaves a story of rebellion, love, and loss. We'll now move on to the third opera of the trilogy, Act 5, an Adam Punk opera, The New Albion Guide to Analog Consciousness. Oh boy, I kinda have a lot to say about the final work in the trilogy here. Let's start with the positives. I like most of the music, which is good. It's got this real great 60s inspired feel to it, as if the entirety of the kaleidoscope of hippie culture was distilled into a musical essence. Act 2, Scene 2's Kyrie is a song that I actually listen to on a regular basis now. It's catchy and uses one of my favorite motifs, the Kyrie liaison from Latin Rite of the Catholic Mass. See Mr. Mister's Kyrie for more details on that, but Guide to Analog Consciousness's Kyrie is the only song that actually sits on a playlist for me. For the most part, it's so separate from the rest of the opera, and is catchy enough that I can get away with just playing it, and most people wouldn't even know what it's from. That being said, I do think that the catchiness of the music can be a problem with Guide, as when you have a really good song that's super catchy and it shows up early, the rest of the time the listener is spent chasing the high that you reached earlier just to find out that it was all downhill from Act 2, Scene 2. Although, now that I'm actually listening to it as I write this, I do think that Voodoo Punk's Ascension is also a jam, and also The Lovers is pretty good, but a lot of those are reprises from previous acts, and okay, whatever. So, the sentiment still stands. Not to say that there aren't standout tracks after Kyrie, it's just that they never reach the heights that Kyrie set. Another thing I thought was cool was the Act 3 twist, where not everything about Elysium is as it seems. It has a love, death, and robots and Event Horizon feel to it. The screaming in Arc 1 is a personal highlight, as well as Lee getting killed in what I can only describe as a jump scare in an audio-only medium. It really does hurt that all the fluff surrounding these moments sullies the actual moment itself, but I'm already getting into the stuff I didn't enjoy, so I guess let's just dive right in. First, the story uses less of the genre it says it is an opera of than the other entries in the series. Outside of the genres of music that it's pulling from and the general idea of the Mascot 3000, the story doesn't really use the ideas of a futuristic society, especially after the story shifts into Elysium, which happens at the start of Act 3. It doesn't seem to utilize the actual themes of Adam Punk, instead choosing to wear the aspects of Adam Punk that it likes as a musical style on itself as a mask to cover up the actual themes underneath that are vapid and empty. The story is more convoluted than it's ever been. Usually in these stories so far, we've had one or two fantastical elements that drive the plot forward. In Dolls, it was the idea that you could bring back souls from the dead and put them into a mannequin. In Radio Hour, it was Lloyd's concept as a whole, as well as the idea that a song could be used as mind control. In Guide, it's like four main things. One is that reincarnation is real. Putting a mind into a computer is real as the second, and travel between different dimensions is a third real thing apparently in this story. There's also a dimension that you go to after you die called Elysium, where you can get a chance at resurrection and reincarnation, which is a fourth thing that you just have to assume with Guide to Analog Consciousness. And this all goes to create a feeling where, unlike Dolls of New Albion, the world isn't fleshed out that well. And unlike the New Albion Radio Hour, the characters aren't super fleshed out, as we're spending more time on explaining concepts that don't seem to fit in this world at all. There is no reason for reincarnation to be a premise that exists, other than to fully link the trilogy together, making Rachel key characters from the first two plays. Overall, the New Albion Guide to Analog Consciousness fumbles in the spots that matter most, like not including more motifs from Dolls and Radio Hour. And that sucks, because it could have been a great ending to a great series. Instead, it sits in a weird, mediocre territory, where I still think I like it, but I don't think it's anywhere near as good as the first two entries in the series. It sits in a space where I don't even know if I can recommend it, because of the weird concepts it implements that are often off-putting. I will say I recommend it to anyone who is as in love with the first two albums of the New Albion trilogy as I was. But if you think you have had your fill after the wackiness of Radio Hour's ending, then maybe duck out for this one. Overall, the New Albion Guide to Analog Consciousness fumbles the ending of a great trilogy, but still has bright shining spots within it that make at least for an interesting listen, if nothing else. Epilogue. So where does that leave us? We looked at a total of 4 story-based albums today, and I guess my point with this video was simply to explore a medium space that I had never really considered before. Unlike film or video games, the music-based story is an interesting one that requires a lot of work to get correct, and I think that the 4 stories I talked today do it well. Overall, I can heavily recommend David Wirsig's Prodigals, The Dolls of New Albion, The New Albion Radio Hour, and I can conditionally recommend The New Albion Guide to Analog Consciousness if it kind of floats your boat. If you liked this video and would like to see more of it, please like the video and consider subscribing. This is all I have for today. Have a good one.